everyone. We are about to begin our keynote roundtable. How do we start? Public policies for the implementation of the SDGs. Within the framework of our seminar, New and Old Perspectives about Development, the International Agenda, and the SDGs. Thank you to Colegio de México, to World Bank, as well as to the National Institute of Statistics. Allow me to introduce myself. I am Vicente Ugalde. I am from the Center for Urban and Environmental Development. And I would like to remind you that the purpose of this roundtable is to discuss how to move from the SDGs, these big 17 goals, to a compatible reference framework of indicators that were presented as part of the SDGs and how to move towards efficient public policies. And how can we implement the SDGs? What we seek during this roundtable is to render the difficulties and complexities of the definition of the SDGs explicit, as well as the definition of the indicators, and how they can be translated into concrete public policies. Additionally, we want to discuss the contradictions that could arise between what happens at a national and international level, as well as the local level, because many of these mechanisms need to be implemented by local stakeholders that often lack the resources necessary to implement what they need in order to have efficient public policies. I am deeply thankful for the presence of the participants of this panel, and I will introduce them in the order in which they are seated. And we will have a couple of rounds of intervention. We will have a first round of 10 minutes, and then we will have a shorter time for comments. On the farther right, we have Félix Vélez Fernandez, who is, as you know, the Vice President of the Board of the National Institute of Statistics. He graduated from ITAM, and he also has a master's from the Woodrow Wilson School of Studies from the University of Princeton, and he is an expert in public policies derived from that program. He is also the coordinator of the master's program in public policies in ITAM, and he has had an active participation as a scholar in ITAM. And as you know, he has worked with the federal government for more than 30 years now. This is only a brief bio of his so that you get an idea of what he has done. He participated as a staff member of the National Population Council, and he is also a member of the National Society of Demography. We also have the presence of Agustín Escobar. He's the director of the Center for Research and Higher Education in Social Anthropology, or CIESAS. We are all very well aware of who he is. He is a level 3 researcher of the National Research System, and he is focused mainly in Mexico-US migration, He is anthropologist by profession. He graduated from the School of Social Anthropology, and he has a degree in sociology from the University of Manchester in England. Welcome, Agustín. Additionally, in this panel, we have the presence of Ana Güezmez. Ana Güezmez has a PhD from the Complutense University of Madrid, and she has oriented her work in the search for development. She also has a degree from the University Cayetano Heredia, and as part of her academic experience, we can say that she was the founder of the Gender Studies program at the University of San Marcos in Peru. Between 2005 and 2010, she was the Latin American and Caribbean counselor at the United Nations Population Fund, and she has worked in different international organizations, namely the Pan American Health Organization. She has been a long-time human rights defender, particularly the rights of women, and she has more than 25 years experience in this field in Latin America. She has participated in fora in more than 15 countries in order for a gender approach to be an essential part of public policies. Welcome, Dr. Güezmez. Welcome to Colegio de México. And finally, I will introduce Dr. Silvia Giorguli, who had to step out for a minute. She is the president of Colegio de México. She is a researcher of the Center for Research on Urban and Environmental Development. She was in this position between 2009 and 2015. She also participates in the draft of the magazine called Coyuntura Demográfica. She is a member of the Mexican Science Academy, and she graduated in sociology from the National Autonomous University of Mexico. She obtained a master's in demography from COLMEX, and she has a PhD in demography as well, and she focuses her research on demographic aspects related to Mexican and U.S. society, particularly in terms of the consequences in education, in families, as well as the transition to adulthood in Latin America. So, as you may see, we have a 5-star panel, and first of all, I would like to yield the floor to you in the same order as I introduced you. So let's go back to this question, which I believe that is very well suited to this discussion. How do we move from indicators to the creation and implementation of effective public policies? Good afternoon to each and every one of you. I believe that in terms of what you expect from this discussion, I should set priorities to the information that I am going to quote in terms of geographical and statistical figures. So I am going to go straight to the point. For the last couple of days, we have talked in depth about this issue, but I believe that one of the main challenges is disaggregation. Disaggregation in terms of gender, income, indigenous communities, migration status, disabilities, as well as geographical position. And the challenge is the following. In countries that have a certain level of development in terms of data collection, there are information gathering systems that perform a variety of census, and they also perform surveys. The majority of the disaggregation of data can be done as as part of a census. But sometimes, some other types of information are better collected through surveys because you have more time, you are able to look for the subjects that will allow you to get a higher quality information. So you need to make a trade-off, as we say, between which benefit is bigger, disaggregating information or having better data collection mechanisms. What I have learned in the INEGI is that sometimes you need to set priorities. For instance, we are at a crossroads on whether we want to give more importance to reliability or availability of information, and Agustín Escobar is the expert about this. But the point is that sometimes you need to make a decision. You need to pick either one or the other. Sometimes you pick a census because you can fully disaggregate information, but it won't necessarily be higher quality information. It's only going to be a matter of having a lot of information, not necessarily high quality information. And I believe that sometimes, depending on your objective, the answer will vary. But we also see certain countries that do not have robust data collection mechanisms, so they need to draw on their existing census in order to retrieve valuable information. Another important thing is the so-called data revolution that shows unexpected possibilities in terms of information retrieved in real time, the information that you get about the public infrastructure, about the plurality of the information, about the incidence of crime in case of real-time information systems. So one of the challenges is to use this system, but also to know about their existence. On the other hand, we need better involvement. We need to know how to bring together civil society, the academia, the private sector, the public sector. Another issue is the development of methodologies. Sometimes there are a lot of limitations when it comes to retrieving information from small locations. And we also need to consider emerging issues. At present, there are still certain topics that are a challenge, even to the scientific community, because we do not have metadata, there is no consensus about their definition, and perhaps there are not many people who are able to do that type of measurement. At least in Latin America and the Caribbean, we have faced this struggle on a constant basis. And there is a second aspect regarding bringing together the different stakeholders, and that is related to the data revolution and monitoring of the SDGs. So, in order for me not to make excessive use of the time available, I think that according to the law, there are attributions that are granted to the National Institute of Statistics for them to train in public servants as well as to develop methodologies. After the enforcement of these laws, there were other projects related to the monitoring of the information related to the attainment of the Millennium Development Goals. The name was changed as of 2015 because we shifted from the MDGs to the SDGs, and perhaps Dr. Enrique Ordaz could tell us more about this, given that he participates as part of the presidential team in charge of the monitoring of the SDGs. And so we see that there are a variety of agencies available who are dealing with this topic, and we also have the UNDP. And as it has already been said, this gives each agency their proper leadership And we all know that in order for bureaucratic systems to move forward, they need processes of this sort, because they need the active participation of relevant government agents such as the presidency. So I am going to go directly into the answer, and I was going to steal a couple of ideas from you, but given that you talked first, I cannot steal those ideas anymore. So the first part of my answer is more or less similar to what you have already said. 4 years ago, several Mexican agencies as well as other organizations, international organizations that were based in Mexico, talked about the importance of a social inclusion system. And as part of these strategies, we needed to think about a universal minimum baseline for per capita income. And we also needed a variety of rights that people had to have access to. 4 years later, this is not possible because public finance has completely changed since then. Back then, we thought that perhaps we could reach this change if we allocated 3 or 4% of the GDP to these efforts, but we will never know because those projects will stop. So right now, in view of budgetary limitations, what can we do? Of course, we are not starting from scratch. We have started working on this. And right now, what I want to focus on is on the things that are currently limiting the creation of a system that has better consequences in terms of the SDGs. And I believe that there are two apparently simple things, but they have been nearly impossible to discuss and implement. The first one, I'm gonna tell it to you, even though we all know that it's a very difficult thing to do. And that is related to information. And I believe that we agree that information can be very hard to retrieve. At present, there are 3 types of retrieving information from Mexico. We have the population census, we have the electoral census, as well as the social development census. None of the censuses has been used as a universal population registry, and Mexico needs to decide what it's gonna do. Either they are going to use only one census or a mix of the 3. However, we cannot continue working in a split way. A lot of money has been put into this, and of course there is room for mistakes, but we are technically capable of finishing our data collection system. Right now, we cannot know what the level of development of a population is if we do not have a proper population registry. With a proper population registry, you know whether someone is going to school or not. So that's the importance of the population census. So this is an effort at the macro level. However, there are certain efforts that have been implemented at the micro level, and they are moving towards the macro level. The poverty pattern has continued. It has remained constant since 1990, and the system for data collection was open almost all of the time, so that we could know which households had received a specific amount of money as well as other types of resources. This data collection system has become broader and broader, and we had an effort which was called Güezmez, and what it sought was to have information from all the Mexican households. And right now, the Ministry of Social Development has a survey that allows you to see that you cannot lie to the data collectors. And for reasons of accountability, it was important to have a census so that people could say, hey, I am registered as part of this social group and you are not giving me the support as you should as a government entity. And right now, we see that 9.4 million households have access to or are included as part of this population census, but the census could be definitely scaled up. We could create a real-time census, as Felix said. It wouldn't be a matter of engaging in the traditional mechanisms, but we could have information of when a person has access to a program, when they find a new job position, if they do not have that position anymore, etc. So in terms of information, I think that we are really far behind because we do have the possibility of creating a data collection system that is robust, but we have not set ourselves to do it. And then the second thing is that we need order and consistency in what we have at the sectorial level as well as at the territorial level. Because, for example, think about the pensions that do not contribute to the tax system. In 2012, I arrived at a meeting where a group was denouncing that the state government has stolen the social programs from them and that they were the people who were in charge of that program and the government had stolen the program for them. And this is evidence that there is utmost disorder. Because right now we have state governments that have non-contributing pensions, and we also have people who have even 2 or 3 pensions, whereas there are certain people that do not have one pension at all. However, we can obtain help from the ministries of health. Until a couple of years ago, the ministries of health had very well-ordered information systems that we could foster from. However, I believe that there have been a lot of modifications for the worse, but it is necessary for there to be systems of this sort, for there to be a way to exchange information, and it is necessary for the government to pay and to give the people what they said they would. Now, in terms of education, we have scholarships from the Ministry of Social Development as well as from the local and state ministries of education. However, there is not a consensus or an alignment between these scholarship programs. 6 or 7 years ago, the 17 scholarship programs from the Ministry of Public Education had been apparently standardized. But a couple of years later, we realized that either the standardization did not take place at a full scale or that program was never actually implemented. So that is why I say that the second aspect is order and consistency, particularly in the context of budgetary limitations. Now, in terms of food, and in terms of supplements, we have been working for 20 years to create the best dietary supplements for young Mexican children. And it was a Prospera program who sought to work on this. And there was a lot of progress. We obtained very good results. And right now, some ministries are starting from scratch. But what we know is that we need to go back to the areas that already have information. We need to go to the science academies that can give us more information about the conditions of Mexican children. However, we need to broaden the scope of these social assistance programs because These should be standardized products that reach each and every Mexican children, and that is not the case yet. These are two very simple things that we have not been able to attain. And I will finish my participation with what we know is hard. If we do not understand the role of the active participation of the public sector, or if we do not understand their role in the big scope of things and not in small limited scale programs, we will see a variety of additional difficulties. Additionally, we need to continue or to foster production once again, not with the programs that we have right now because they are very limited in scope. What we need are broader policies. These are the things that will allow us to move forward, and we will not be able to move forward if we do not work in this sense. Thank you. Good afternoon to each and every one of you. Thank you very much to Colegio de México for their invitation. Thank you very much, Dr. Giorguli. Thank you, World Bank, as well as the National Institute of Statistics, for your kind invitation. It is always a pleasure to share a panel with Felix as well as with Agustín Escobar. I always come back to the Colegio de México because of the importance they had in the reception that they gave to the Spanish population during the times of exile. And yesterday there was an important thing that took place in Spain, and perhaps many of you are well aware about the process of exile, the Spanish exile to Mexico. But from this experience, I think that with regards to the question, we know that development is not linear. And I believe that the paradigm imposed by the SDG is that we need a worldwide social agreement so that we are able to reach these goals. The UN was created in 1945 after 2 world wars, and right now we have more countries in open conflict throughout the world. Additionally, we need to review multilateralism with the learned experiences that we have seen in recent months. For instance, with the Brexit, we see that there is a shift in the paradigm of European organization. There is also an important perspective that will change throughout Latin America and North America as well with the election of Donald Trump. So I like to quote Grispan because he says that if the UN is not working right now, we need to modify the UN in order for it to address world issues. However, right now we still have the same paradigm by which the Security Council system, for instance, was not modified. But with regards to the question, I believe that the important thing is that development is not linear, and right now we see that there's going to be a new Secretary General in the UN, and that is a sign of hope for many of us. Many of us were waiting or expecting for there to be a woman Secretary General, but unfortunately that did not happen. Second, I need to acknowledge the role that Mexico has had in the negotiations and international discussions with regards to sustainable development. And for instance, Félix Vélez, who is the chair of the Latin American Board of Statistics and who is also the president of the Board on Gender, has worked a lot in these issues for many years. The chair, Vicente Ugalde, has represented Mexico in different international fora with regards to the listing of the indicators, because sometimes we see that whatever cannot be measured cannot be considered as existing. However, the point is that we need high quality evidence, and in my particular field of expertise, which is gender, and in order for you to get an example, after the conference of Beijing in 1995, where we talked about a timeline as an essential aspect of development, we realized that not a single country had made the research in terms of time scales. Right now, we have already set ourselves goals in terms of time, and we are also addressing a different challenge, which is disaggregation as well as standardization of these reference frameworks. At present, there are 19 countries that have measured time to some extent as part of their national statistics. Mexico was also a pioneer in this, and right now we know that 24% of the GDP is a result of informal labor, mostly performed by women. On the other hand, I need to say that in terms of foreign affairs, Mexico has showed a big responsibility towards the international community. And in contrast to other rounds of negotiation, one of which was led by Jeffrey Sachs, and with regards to the SDGs, the negotiation has been very broad, very open. It has not been led by the General Secretary, but by the countries themselves. The statistics group was created, and here the Philippines as well as Mexico have had a major role. There were surveys throughout the world that showed the consistent participation of young groups in the voting process in Mexico City. And the second advantage that I see and that I hope will take place is a paradigm shift. Right now, the economic conditions are pushing us in a particular direction. However, I believe that the SDGs show a paradigm shift. Why? Because this is an international or a universal agenda. In contrast to the previous agenda, the 2015 agenda, the goals are global. It's not like back then when we had 7 goals for one specific region and the rest were applicable to the rest of the countries. And this allows us to overcome a limitation that was deeply harmful because it focuses on economic, social, and environmental issues. Because as many of you know, all these topics are interrelated. There is a cross relationship between each one of the topics. So that is why I believe that we also need to segment the programs. And we also need to make modifications inside the UN. This is a very ambitious agenda that must be followed by all countries, and it has a triple vision that summons all the stakeholders to participate. In the past, it was a matter of calling for action among civil society or even civil society organizations as well as other stakeholders, but right now, the call for action is a lot bigger. For instance, Colegio de México is not only a passive stakeholder, they are taking active part in the implementation of the SDGs from a human rights approach. It's also very important to consider the interaction between the private sector as well as the academia in order to address the big regional challenge that we are facing, because we see that in spite of the context and the evidence, no positive labor conditions were created within the private sector. We also need to consider the participation of local stakeholders. And considering that we are in a region that is 80% urban, we need to modify our approach. The C40 summit will be held in Mexico City. Here we will have the presence of 40 city mayors, 14 of which are women, and actually the summit will be chaired by a woman. And we see that these cities have been essential in the struggle to decrease or to release greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere. Additionally, in Puebla, we will have the first Endire of a local nature. So these are some of the things that will take place. We see the variety of stakeholders that are participating, and for the first time, gender equality as well as investment and in women and girls is a cross-sectional topic across all the goals. Particularly, there is a specific goal with regards to the empowerment and the rights of women and girls, and that is goal number 5. I think that this has been a very important issue discussed inside Colegio de México in order to analyze how we can boost women, how we can draw on the demographic bonus as well as on the gender bonus. This is part of the big scope, the overarching scope of the agenda. And right now, I think that the main challenge is related to the implementation of these programs and strategies. I believe that Latin America is quite paradoxical because we have signed all the international agreements in terms of human rights, and we have standardized our local legal framework to them. However, we are still the most unequal region of the world. And I believe that in terms of statistics, we have talked about the creation of information systems. Additionally, I think that localization is essential. There has been an effort on the part of the federal government on this in this regard, but we need to customize the agenda according to the local characteristics. We also need to ask questions with regards to funding. How are we going to allocate public resources for this objective? And in terms of gender equality, in spite of the fact that we know what's the importance of allocating resources for gender equality, we see that only a scarce amount of resources is allocated for this. For instance, Mexico only allocates 0.5% of the GDP for gender equality, whereas the United Nations allocate only 0.2% of the budget in gender-related projects. Additionally, we need to think about technology. Technology will be essential with regards to implementation. And finally, I want to say that next year Mexico will host the Latin American and the Caribbean High-Level Forum that is created along with the help of the General Secretariat of the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean. In this high-level forum, Félix Vélez will be very important because he will help us show what are the different dimensions of the lack of access to equal opportunities. And this is strictly related to the creation of inclusive public policies. Second, there are certain agendas that have not been fully met. So in terms of development, we haven't properly dealt with the issues related to economic empowerment as well as decrease of insecurity. But there are also other issues such as energy as well as the creation of new masculinities. And in this sense, the participation of institutions such as Colegio de México will be essential. Third, we need to face the fact that we are in the context of economic deceleration, and if we do not create according public policies, there will be an impact, for example, in women. There was a decrease in the extreme poverty rate since 2004. However, there is also increased inequality throughout the region. So we need to ask ourselves how we are going to work in this sense. And finally, I think we need to talk about investment. We are focusing on economic activism, and we made a research project along with UN Women as well as the National Institute for the Rights of Women, and we realized that 7% of the human development value of women is lost as a result of domestic violence. So we need to think where we are going to allocate our resources and where we are going to place our efforts with regards to statistical analysis. And hopefully next year we will be able to have a gender approach when we collect information. However, I believe that the main challenge is related to the creation of public policies based on indicators and reliable information. And we need to do this quickly because it's not possible to think that there will be gender equality in 80 years. Additionally, we need to ask ourselves questions with regards to multilateralism. But overall, I think that I want to share some hope with you. I have been working at the United Nations systems for 20 years now, and right now I think that the SDGs present a new paradigm that we need to promote and defend, and definitely I hope that we will attain the SDGs. This is a 15-year project which hopefully will be successful, and hopefully we will see positive results throughout the world. Thank you very much, Dr. Güezmez, and now we will listen the intervention from Dr. Silvia Giorguli. Hopefully I will not have to step out. I am a little bit sick, but Dr. Güezmez said more or less what I wanted to say as my closing remarks for this seminar. But I think that in the beginning, we thought that it was very important for this panel to recover some of the most important points from the previous presentations. And given that we have so much experience working alongside the INEGI, and given that we like to finish our events doing new things, we want to ask a question about the definition. Although this was not the core objective of our seminar, we had to ask ourselves what's the definition of development from the perspective of public policies. And actually, that was one of the reasons why we invited Vicente Ugalde, who is an expert in that field and who was an excellent moderator for this panel. So I believe that there are three things that we need to take into consideration. First of all, the lessons learned with regards to the SDG agenda and the indicators. I am not going to build too much on this. The rest of you can contribute with what you think I was missing. And I believe that the final comments that Anna made with regards to the positive aspects, with the synergies, with the importance of agreements, with the importance of a well-aware and summoning agenda is very important. I think that we have talked about the challenges, and it is also important to show that there is awareness with regards to the challenges, such as the creation of indicators, either simple or complex. Right now we see that we have approximately 160 goals, in contrast to the 230 indicators. And yes, there is tension. There is tension as well as some opposition between certain indicators, but these indicators are flexible and we have the possibility of making modifications to the agenda. Now, I believe that there is a very important issue that was discussed by Ambassador Ruiz Cabañas, and that is with regards to consensus between countries. If we see this as a process that starts adding different dimensions to development, if we consider issues such as human rights approaches, such as the environmental perspective as well as the social perspective, this would allow us to broaden our scope with regards to other issues that are not directly related to development, such as migration. And as I said, it is very clear that there have been positive results due to the participation of the international community, and we see that there are local entities such as INEGI that have identified the need for the creation of new technological capabilities as well as data collection systems. And the idea that information is necessary for us to assess the current context has become deeply entrenched. Additionally, when we were thinking about the organization of this roundtable, we expressed our concern for the fact that we needed to go from general to specific in terms of the international and local frameworks. However, I think that we have already talked about a variety of issues that have been the result of very rich discussions. And now, going back to a positive note, I believe that there are a couple of things that are still missing in terms of what we can add to this complex discussion. Throughout the presentations, we heard about the lessons learned from the MDGs, and I believe that that is closely related to how we move from the implementation of the indicators to the limitations of the proper assessment that is necessary. Because right now, on a separate way, both mechanisms and both systems are very good, but what we need is better coordination with them. And right now, we are thinking we are at a crossroads because we do not know if what we cannot measure should be part of public policies. And I am going to quote something about the MDGs. What gets measured gets done. So what happens what you cannot measure? And Susan Baker asked this question: do we target what we can measure, or do we measure what we want to target? So I believe that there is a conceptual part of the indicators that has an impact in decision-making processes with regards to the draft and implementation of public policies. And currently in Mexico, we talk a lot about the fact that it is necessary to broaden the scope of our social coverage, but it's not only a matter of covering more people, but of having more or higher quality services. And here we see that there are certain issues related to the data that we are measuring, because sometimes you are able to collect the data which might not be particularly relevant to the approach that you want for a particular public policy. I believe that there are still some national challenges that were presented during Enrique's presentation, as well as Dr. Martinez's presentation, and which has also been quoted by Agustín, with regards to the cross-sectoral participation of different stakeholders. And here I would like to talk about a particular issue that I discussed with Vicente as well as other members of the academia from different countries. And that is that right now we see that there is a shift in the perspective that we have about the state. And right now I am going to talk to you about examples from the population policies because that's my area of expertise. In the 70s, we saw that the state was in charge of unilaterally creating the public policies that were enforced. However, this is not the best option because right now the context has varied. At present, states define public policies in collective spaces, not only collective in terms of the draft of the agenda. And it's not only collective in terms of summoning civil society organizations, but it's also a collective effort in the implementation at a local, state, and national implementation. And there is also a case that was related to population, and that is with regards to sexual and reproductive health. There was a stagnation of the indicators, and in some areas there wasn't even any change. And this is related to the process of centralization of the Mexican state and the decision-making processes inside the states. So we need to ask ourselves, is this a positive thing to do, or are there some other consequences on other indicators that are related to the implementation and attainment of the SDGs? Another issue that was not talked in depth was from the top-down focus and the bottom-up focus. So we need to think what's the cross-sectoral coordination, the coordination with the government, and how you ensure success in the interpretation of data. And this is related to the interpreters in charge of the implementation of the SDGs. And I think that we should have more discussions when we talk about the possible or the feasible success of the 2030 agenda. We also talked about accountability mechanisms. So this is a way of thinking how we move from the international agreements to their actual implementation. And I believe that there are certain limitations resulting from sovereignty, but there are also certain areas of opportunities. Vicente Ugalde translated a book which is very pertinent and which was published by Colegio de México, and one of the authors is Pierre Lascaux, and it says that based on the experience of different countries, we know that public policies face a variety of challenges and they are often not successful. And sometimes they think that the possibility of solving social issues is nearly impossible. So this is related to the new ways that we think about when we talk about drafting policies, when we separate decision-making mechanisms to the actual implementation of our programs. And we also need to consider issues such as the times necessary for implementation. And this text also focuses on the mistake of focusing exclusively on decision-making procedures rather than on implementation as well. And I had a question as well. I didn't ask Enrique a question that came up to me. And when we talked about the participation of the academia, we need to ask ourselves, what now? What now from the standpoint of scholars? So as Anna said, we have been working with women. We have a project about the 2030 agenda in terms of gender. And we have followed the work of Luis Jaimes with regard to sustainable cities. we hosted an event with regards to big data as well as data revolution, which was hosted by the World Bank. And I believe that discussions like the ones we had during this past couple of days have been very important in order for us to move to very specific discussions. It's a matter of going from general to specific, and we need to introduce a common agenda. And Anna said that she could work as part of the implementation of the agenda. I am not very sure of that because we are better at doing the paperwork and retrieving the information, but I believe that there is a team led by President Díaz-Anulo who is doing a very good job, not only in terms of the analysis of the energy situation right now, but they are thinking about how new public policies can be implemented in this regard. And finally, I think that another pending issue, which I must say that we looked for someone to ask or to know particularly about funding for these type of projects. And a very big pending issue is that for the next couple of years in which there will be limitations in terms of the economy, we need to see how we can use our resources in a more effective way. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Silvia Giorguli. Now, I'm going to try to readdress from this first round of interventions a couple of points, and if you would like to address them, and then we are going to go for our audience Q&A session. So, very quickly, I'm going to try to pose in some questions your so interesting positions. So Félix Vélez talked about government levels and private agents and the importance that this has on the technical abilities. And also, I'd like to mention something that Mr. Escobar mentioned on coherence as a higher challenge. And these driftings on fragmentation that Ana Güezmez mentioned. And all of this idea that's floating around, I'd like to readdress it in a metaphor that Silvia Giorguli mentioned, in the sense that I believe that SDGs objectives and the ambition that fosters them is something laudable. However, the next question, and the one that has gathered us today, appears to be more complicated when trying to address it. So then I go back to the metaphor that Silvia Giorguli mentioned, in the sense that when we think about implementation, we think about less in the composer and the notes, all of this international effort on leading objectives and goals and then indicators. We think less about that and we start thinking about the executors, those who play that music, and the audience. And I think that both of them, at least in these discussions, are just absent. And it's normal because we are in a stage where we formulate, where we think about the music. But maybe this last roundtable brings us to the fact that we have to start thinking about the audience, and that's very complicated because of the ambition of starting so many topics and so many goals. So I will start by asking. I know you're gonna say nothing, but I will start by trying to prioritize what's urgent and what's not. And the second question is just because I'd like to create or cause a reaction, and maybe it's not a very good question, but there's a proposal on what the seminar has offered to ask. There is a transformation in the content of this notion to what we are helping with these SDGs. And I can think of a very trivial example for someone that's not so rich in terms of economy. So, the GDP, His Majesty the GDP, could it stop being the most important part and maybe thinking about another globalized indicator? In the same order that you address the audience. Well, I have a dilemma here, and it is not existential, but it's work related. INEGI, as an autonomous institution, as public officers, we don't like talking about the design or the instrumentation of public policies. Beside all my professional expertise has surrounded that. I'm going to discuss generally some situations and then I'm going to go for GDP. First of all, something that hasn't been said because it's obvious is that here we included UN Statistic Division because for the Millennium Goals it was not so. And that's why the work is so hard and so important, because when including Statistic Division, then it's aiming for each indicator to establish a goal. For example, Montevideo report, it has indicator, but it doesn't have any goal. Here we have many goals, and many of them are multimodal or multidimensional. So we need several indicators for only one goal. So yes, we need to acknowledge how valuable this fact is, adding the UN Statistic Division, but no doubt, partly because we are just formulating, we shouldn't think about what's absent, and also because we are doing it this time. We are doing it strictly compared to other times, and I think that I'd like to celebrate the fact that this happened because it was not so obvious, of course. And if you cannot measure accurately, then of course what comes after is going to have decrease in yields. And the second thing that I'd like to address, and this would be just surpassing jurisdictional limits here and managerial limits, is that Theodore Lowy would separate three types of public policies. On one hand, we would have the ones that he called distributive, regulatory, and redistributive. The simplest ones, well, the distributive, because you would give something to someone without apparently taking anything to anyone else, and apparently because everything has an opportunity cost. Then regulatories, that was in international trade, if you benefit a sector, you will affect another one, and then things become more visible. And the third one would be distributive, when you have rich against poor. And then this has to do with income description and personal distribution of income. The third ones are the most complicated ones, and we don't have that many of them in the 23rd agenda because we are not talking about reducing the 30 points. And from that point of view, I believe that there are topics that are very hard, historically speaking. For example, President Roosevelt had a negotiation outside the Congress, and when the Congress voted for the package, it was because everything was created. It was like the Mexican way for electoral situations, if you want to look for a simile. And for specific topics such as creating a social security situation, that's what more or less happened. So regulatorily speaking, well, these are not topics such as international trade. What I do believe to be serious is financing. Because, well, world's growth is stopping, international trade due to export is also decreasing. It has even become negative in Mexico. And I mean, these are data from the IRS. I mean, not even by the INEGI. So there's also a public deficit, relatively big, like 4% of the GDP, but in a specific context, there's a huge drop of public policies, and this is because there is money taken to pay interests. This money is a debt. So as I can see here, what Silvia mentioned in terms of financing is going to be transcendental, and for Mexico, as well as for anyone else. Now, there's a positive situation. It's always been said that oil, silver have been like blessings for Mexico, having raw material. And what we've seen is that profitability, of course, has to do with consumption. It is an investment. So we are in a new economical era because right now we don't have rent of raw material in sight. So I mean, I'm not thinking that the tax reform at the beginning of this government would have been feasible if the oil tax income hadn't fell so abruptly. So, yes, it's true that profitability was dissipated. It's also true that it was inefficiently, historically speaking. And of course, I am going back to the 19th century. And yes, in that sense, maybe the same financial stringency would stop you from spending more. But on the positive side, it's going to allow to spend more efficiently. And GDP, well, since I was studying economics at the beginning of the 80s, the GDP was the main thing always. So yes, I mean, the GDP, I think the GDP is not everything. It won't have to do with income distribution, wealth, environment, gender perspective, but it does say a lot. I mean, I have to reivindicate the GDP. I mean, if a country has a GDP that's adjusted by the power of purchase with a priority such as Haiti, that's less than $1,000 per year, and that a country such as Luxembourg has $80,000 per year, then I mean that does say something. I mean, you cannot say that it is just an idle information. I mean, I think that it is very clear that GDP is not enough, yes, but I do believe that you need something that measures the power of purchase of a country. And this is statistically speaking, and actually who promoted this were United Nations during the 48. I mean, the original numbers for production and GDP, savings and accumulating capital, transactions with foreign activities and its location were approved in the United Nations in 1948. So this is just an additional example of the multilateralism that Ana Güezmez has reivindicated, fortunately. So thank you very much. Thank you very much. And what you just said is very interesting. Of course, I don't mean or attempt to respond. But first of all, I started from the budgetary shortness, and facing this, as well as the lack of synergy and lack of coordination, then I think that one solution could be coordination. But secondly, with priority, I have a very obvious answer as a Coneval's counselor. The multidimensional methodology for poverty measurement in Mexico is precisely a synthetic measurement. This means that this is a measurement that covers a set of rights that legislators have set as the rights that had to be measured, not the priority ones, I mean the one that had to be measured minimum. Of course, with this, they declared a priority. However, and I also say this clearly, this is influenced by Coneval's discussions. A country cannot be obsessed with poverty. The thing is what comes after, and what comes after is development, and that we agree. Development has lower thresholds, but for families, people, or education. However, it's something that's open upwards. I mean, it doesn't have a threshold that would define poor. And we have to acknowledge poor people because they still have to be a priority for policies. But with this multidimensional measure, we can also reach a measurement which opens the goals and the future. Now, coverage and quality. I mean, it's not new, and probably in the past we were not so wrong about what a service would offer, but we just thought about having the right to receive a service. But today, being like the right holder doesn't really mean that much. I mean, if you have the right to go to a practice, to a doctor, but the doctor is full, then it doesn't say anything. However, we do need to reach new measures for everything that matters. Something that incorporates quality, health, educational, housing quality. I think that housing, we are closer to measure housing than any other aspects, but each dimension is different. Now, I do believe that precisely a problem for accountability would be fragmentation. We have responsibilities that are not entirely exclusive or allocated, and this creates a fundamental problem for the expenditure and for accountability. And last but not least, and because of the academics as instrumenters here at El Colegio de México, or not, I believe that during the 80s, the Mexican society changed in a certain way. There was a huge adaptation movement, as Mercedes González de la Rocha mentioned, with more women in the work market after 1982. But I believe that we still need, once again, to know how population is adapting to change. Who's the population, how it's reacting, what are the programs that are actually being used by the population, in the sense that, or in best senses, because I mean, it could be, no? There's a possibility. And I do believe that this research is priority today. You already talked about the instrumenter and the population, user, citizen, etc., as something that needs to be considered. I think that we have to readdress it, that we are assuming that's the same as it was 20 years ago, and I don't think we should. I mean, housing size, family members, etc., there have been many members, but we don't know precisely what this means for household interaction, for example. Thank you very much. Your question is very stimulating, and I think that it readdresses what Silvia just said on implementation. And I think that part of what we are discussing is the governance of implementation when talking about multi-agents, when talking about sectors, government levels. It's just very complex. And there's also another topic that I think Mexico is exploring, and I believe it to be able to generate a reconfiguration in public policies. And I'm talking about open government, information access, transparency, accountability, as Felix mentioned. And I do believe that an interesting story is what's been going on with climate change. I mean, the SDGs try to establish public local assets. I mean, I cannot understand countries such as China or even France or Mexico that have ratified the agreement on Paris climate change without Mario Molina or all of an entire research body that would reconfigure or reset up, considering environmental sustainability as the core of everything. So I do believe that there's always an entire work between academia and public policies that goes through a reconfiguration of public global assets, local assets also, where we are placing the planet and equality at the core of everything. Second, because I was the witness of the effort that Mexico underwent in order to be included in migration situations in sustainable agendas, and it didn't progress, as it didn't progress either in Cairo's conference, which was something that wasn't at all developed in that conference. And actually, the agreement of the UN on migratory workers and their families is one of the less ratified ones. Only 45 votes. I think that Mexico has done it, Guatemala, Salvador, Honduras, and most of the countries, yes. But it's important to mention, and this is kind of important, that the agenda for SDGs does not eliminate the rest of the agendas. I mean, human rights frameworks, for example, all of the agreements are still there. Financing agreement for development that was agreed upon in Elizabeth, I think that is very important. Because we need to relate it, and it's still there. And also the agreement on climate change in Paris, the urban agenda, the agenda on biodiversity in Cancun, that I think that's also another public asset. And the fact that oceans, etc., were included is great. And I think that this is going to be very complicated, but we are going to go to a global forum on migration in 2018. And second, I love the metaphor on music notes and composers that Vicente mentioned. I think that the music writing is just out there, and this development paradigm is just a sort of music, yes, and I would add the fact that we need to work in composing it. Integration, duplicity of our social policies, because I think that Mexico concretely still has a lot of work to do in terms of regulation. I think that there's still a lot of work to do, and of course in redistributive policies, that's the horizon for equality, I guess, and it's fundamental. But yes, I'd like to introduce the metaphor of a choir, of a chorus, I mean, how can we make all of the voices, just as in a song, the chorus can be connected in different roles, but working on the same song, I think that if we are to overcome fragmentation of politics and society, still will have to be a fundamental situation. And with my predecessors, at the end of the day, the horizon of equality is fundamental for a region. I think that multidimensional measuring of poverty provides a lot of input, and I think Mexico was, as well as other countries in the region, tried to provide a poverty indicator as part of multidimensional indicator, but the region will do it. I mean, there's an agreement on the fact that the multidimensional measurement for inequality is going to be included. The GDP is there, yes, but it's not going to be there by itself. And yes, from our perspective, and now I'd like to take the opportunity to ask for Agustin's advocacy, as well as Silvia's, because we are working on it. We like for that multidimensional measurement to have time also. And actually we are working very hard on conceptualizing time poverty in paradigmatic aspects. I think that maybe one of the most paradigmatic from gender perspective and rights perspective would be placing care and time as a global public asset. Taking care in the household being done by women, so we aspire to have that constituting in Mexico with the implementation of the SDGs for the first time, which also has the right to take care of your household. Uruguay just did it central to Tabaré Vázquez policies in his administration, and it was included a national system of care, and today it has a law, and it's helping integrate social protection, basic right to it, because many places of the region have fragmented health services. There is no comprehensive health department. Health, work, etc. are not related. So I think that from the gender perspective and the paradigmatic perspective, it's a world that needs to put time in the core of it and not income. So I think that this would be very worthwhile thinking about it. Well, almost everything has been said, so I'd like to readdress two things. One of it is the metaphor that Vicente has already mentioned. You already added the choir to it. So this event revolved around the music and the participation of different composers. So we have still a question. Esperanza Delgado already left, but one of the question is the participation of the civil society organizations that are very active in the agenda, in international fora, but what would be their role in the next step? And maybe I am unaware, but it's not as clear to me what's their participation in the next part of the music. It would appear for us to agree on the music, but we also need to continue working on it, And I'm going to take an example which was discussed on gender violence, and I like to address this because these are one of the new dimensions within the SDGs. I mean, in the presentation by Arturo Alvarado, it was very clear how important it was, and in Martinez Olvide, he was saying that it was one of the two indicators that were not there because gender violence was for other national contexts. So I think that this work in terms of the music, the lyrics from Mexico within the SDGs in Mexico is still pending. I have a question that's clear to me that's not in his job. According to what Felix said from the beginning, maybe it's the job of the Carnival because he does evaluate the implementation process of the policies and the usage of the resources, etc. And that has to do with the base indicators, but it's not as clear how we are going to evaluate and what part of the processes are failing in the implementation of the programs. And in this part for intersectorial communication, there's a huge question that may be a subject for the next forum. To what extent are federal administrations, in Mexico's case specifically, require changes to adapt to this intersectorial agenda, etc., etc. And GDP, what I would say is that one of the things that's a conclusion for me is that this agenda is complex and everyone is concerned about their own specific indicators. We saw that yesterday with the next presentation that's worried about environmental situations, and the GDP was not necessarily mentioned. When we're talking about gender violence, the GDP is not necessarily mentioned. So I think that the complexity and the fact that each is in each sector would give a specific tone to it. So I would like to add that indicators wise, the GDP introduction, according to Agustin, maybe it's not so well liked in Mexico, but I'm going to exemplify. In terms of gender equality and girls' participation in places, we have a long process. We have a process that needs generating a safe place so that girls participate more. So that's not going to have a specific indicator that allows you to measure changes year after year. So these are longer processes. So I believe that this dynamism in the agenda as well as the specific models allow incorporating these social change parameters that not necessarily can be measured with specific markers or indicators. Thank you very much, Silvia. I don't know, I think I have 10 minutes left, but can Ricardo confirm? Oh, no, no. Okay, yeah, I have 10 minutes. Okay, so I'm going to use them if I may. If the panel members allow me to, I'll go for a Q&A session with the audience. So could you please raise your hand? We have one question at the back. We have two questions. Thank you very much to both of you. Well, from the government standpoint, trying to focus on what you've been saying for 2 days, I'd like to know if you share this vision. I see two main blocks or aspects, a technical one and a political one. The technical one is led by the technical committee of the ODMs, which is by the administration, the presidency, where you have to discuss all of the indicators where it is important defining what's the main battery, where we have to define priority, which ones can be measured immediately with information that we have, which ones are going to be measured in the second step, and which ones long term. So we can find a strategy for said measurement. Now, based on these indicators, we can start working on the calculation with federal government entities and go towards the baseline. We have to have a baseline which is urgent, so we can have a platform where Mexico is starting from. On the other hand, and these have to be related at the end of the day because they feedback each other, we have the political focus, the definition of policies and what is the work of implementation. Now, this group would be integrated or led by the National Commission for the SDGs compliance that just announced its publication like a very short time ago in the official gazette. So that's where we have to work on the development. How are we visualizing it? What do we want? All of the discussions on how we are to fight against poverty. What do we understand? The articulation of each goals is how are we going to be able to focus resources towards the priority and like this have a public policy roadmap. I think that this work is just as important because that's the problem that happens with the millennial sustainable goals that we wanted to measure, but we were not able to articulate it with public policy. So we did have a degree of compliance, but we were not able to progress in that sense. I think that currently we have that possibility, and we have the mechanism that was created through the National Commission or the National Council for the SDGs compliance. And that's where we have a cross-sectional access, which is the academia, private sectors, and organized civil societies. These three main groups articulate or participate in both blocks or parts. And that's where we're going to have the reinforcement of this policy, because that's where if we were able to develop in diagnosis databases, so we could include the participation of these three main players, then we will reach an agenda that's inclusive for the entire society, which will have validity and a commitment by all of the parties. On the other hand, we have another block or aspect, which is public policies, where there's the main role of the academic sector and the private sector is the most relevant one. Maybe also the organized civil societies, but I would say that the academic sector would be the main one that could provide elements for defining where do we want to go in terms of the conceptual theoretical framework. And of course, el Colegio de México could be the lead in all of it. So I don't know if you visualize it like that, or do you have any other elements that could complete this idea? Thank you very much. The second question, please. I just wanted to conclude with a comment related with implementation. Mexico is also part of a multi-agent platform, the development efficiency participation, and there was a meeting in Kenya where multiple agents represented by the alliance met. philanthropical institutions, donors, South-South cooperation, alliances, legislators, etc., in order to have a report on the evaluation on the quality for international cooperation and how this is aligned to the 2030 agenda. In Mexico's case, there was a proposal, once again, on confirming the multidimensional focus. In this case, it was specified as a criteria for allocating international aid. As you may know, CARES determines the list of receiver countries in terms of the GDP. So Mexico's proposal is to see how we can use multidimensional models as poverty, multidimensional indicators, so we don't leave anything out of the 2030 agenda priorities. Well, I may sound insistent, but it's a huge challenge being able to have metadata and information sources for the 230 indicators plus what accumulates this week. I mean, that's for starters. But in terms of public policy, I mean, being able to overcome those 230 indicators related to 169 goals is huge. And I have two things here that concern me. On one hand, and it has happened to us at the institution, what's most important, environmental statistics or poverty statistics or information on gender perspective? I mean, there are things that are very obvious about which one we prefer, but there are others that we need to have a survey. For example, if it is an environmental against poverty, well, I mean, quantitatively speaking, we cannot say this one is more important than the other. And this brings me to the fact that at some point we will have to prioritize, because interest rates in Mexico are going to go up and resources that the state will have are going to be less. I mean, that's not a matter of ideology. It's just the way things are going, and the probability is close to 1. So what worries me, what concerns me is that on the one hand we have a dialogue between academia, experts, the government on rights, on reivindicating and complying with them, and on the other hand we have also dialogue by the government, by the academia, on economic restrictions and public finances. So there's like very little connection between them. It's like one is here and the other one is out there, and they ponder, they think, very deeply, but the lack of the connection between one world and the other is going to be a big problem, and there's not going to be enough money. So now about Cesar's comment, my dear Cesar, I am not 100% sure that the millennial goals haven't been taken into account by policymakers, because I do believe that in terms such as death for maternity, if there was, having a goal and a commitment in different entities would make some noise, and they would make them work for it, and with any constraint that in Mexico lack of professionalization of public policies processes may be, I did realize that this was addressed. Maybe it could have been more addressed, but it's not that we didn't care at all about it, Thank you.
I don't think I have anything else to add. I believe that although most indicators are of statistical nature, there are many others that are of qualitative nature, and they should also be taken into consideration. Particularly in terms of gender equality, the point is to determine whether there are legal frameworks that allow us to oversee and to enforce the law in terms of gender equality and non-discrimination. So, for example, in the case of Mexico, it wouldn't be possible to seek gender equality as well as the elimination of discrimination if we didn't have the proper legal framework. And we see that sometimes women are a very vulnerable group in the Mexican context because of the labor conditions as well as many other conditions that they are subject to. I believe that the separation proposed by César Garcés did take place at the United Nations, and I'm not going to talk about what happened in Mexico because I am most aware of what happened at the global level, and the result was not positive. This idea of having a small group defining the concept and enlisting which were the technical indicators for every country, that was not a good solution. I believe that there should be independence as well as autonomy in data generation and collections, such as there exists in Mexico with the INEGI and the Coneval. However, I believe that there must be a more participatory system to do this. In this sense, I believe that there have been positive experiences in other countries, and I feel that Mexico is headed in that direction, although I believe that we are not allocating the budget in order to attain the necessary results. Right now, it is essential to have measurable results that have accountability mechanisms, and there should also be participatory schemes for all the stakeholders. I believe that we need further discussion about this. And in that sense, it is essential for us to be aware that we are at the margin of the context, and all the national and international evidence in this sense is showing us that investment in women and girls as well as their empowerment is one of the biggest areas of opportunity if countries decide to invest in that regard. However, we see that many countries are not willing to include this approach as part of their public policies. So right now the challenge is for these essential topics to be included and actually implemented. And I believe that the idea of building a partnership between countries, and particularly a development-oriented partnership, is essential. Cooperation should not only take place between countries, there should also be decentralized cooperation. And in that sense, I think that the work of AMEXIT is highly valuable. Right now, we see that a lot of the budget for gender equality comes from the federal government. But if we see what sum is being allocated by the local or the state governments, we see that the sums are very small. And we also need to abide by what the United Nations has said and the indicators that it has used. We see that the United Nations, as well as Carlos Elichari, who is present here, have determined that according to the existing figures, the majority of the crimes against women and girls take place in our region. So those are the paradigms that we need to talk about. However, I think that the main challenge is implementation, implementation, and implementation. It's time to actually attain these goals, for these to be the reality of the people. And we need to have a closer coordination between entities, because this is essential, at least for our region. Thank you. I think I wouldn't add anything, but thank you very much for your comment. So with these realistic notes, and I believe that we cannot forget what Dr. Güezmez said, we need a multilateral effort, and we should not lose sight of this. So having this realistic note at the end of this session is showing us that we are really raising awareness about the monumental challenge that we are facing. And although this realistic note is not a reason for celebration, I think that deep down, we should be satisfied about the work that we have done. And I am personally satisfied by having had the opportunity to chair this session. Thank you to each of the participants for their participation, and I will just tell you their names. So once again, they are Félix Vélez, Silvia Giorguli, as well as Ana Güezmez. Thank you very much for having participated during this session. We will have a very short closing panel. So please, could Carlos join us? So now we will proceed to our closing panel. I am going to yield the floor to Félix Vélez as well as Carlos Silva Jauregui. And I would only say that on behalf of the President of Colegio de México, Dr. Silvia Giorguli, I want to thank several outstanding participants for being here. First of all, thank you very much to Colegio de México for hosting this event, New and Old Perspectives about Development, the International Agenda, and SDGs. Thank you very much to Félix Vélez, to the National Institute of Statistics, to Ricardo Rodriguez, to Miriam Garcia, Carla Díaz Cortés, and María del Carmen Bobadilla. From the World Bank, thanks to Carlos Rodriguez and Maria Brito for everything they did with regards to the organization of this event. On behalf of the President of Colegio de México, Dr. Silvia Giorguli, I want to thank Arturo Alvarado, Jaime Sobrino, who are the directors of the CEDU as well as the Center for Sociological Studies, respectfully, Montserrat Young, Rosa María López Bustos, Elizabeth Serratos, Angélica García, Reina Chávez, Jesús Fuentes. To the members of the General Services Department, Miguel Segura. To the PRED, the Program for Educational or for Digital Education. without the help of whom the transmission of this seminar online wouldn't have been possible. Thank you to Leon Ruiz, to Hector Gutierrez, and thank you very much to Rodrigo Villaseñor, Carla Rodriguez, Cuauhtémoc Ernesto Sánchez, he's somewhere around here, as well as Jaime Vera. Thank you very much to all the staff of Colegio de México, to the staff of INEGI, to the staff of the World Bank. Thank you very much for your participation. And of course, thank you very much to all the assistants. Thank you very much, Carlos Silva and Félix Vélez. I had outlined 7 points for this closing panel, but what I'm going to do is to send them to the organizers so they can disseminate them among the assistants, because right now it's not the time to continue talking about this. I'm only give you a couple of figures for 1 minute. There were 28 conferences, 157 members that were invited. Assistants per sector, we had 85 members of the academia, 38 members of the general public, 20 attendees from the INEGI, 9 attendees from the private sector, 4 from international organizations, and 1 from civil society organizations. In total, we had 157 assistants, and we had more than 40 people participating as part of the organizing committee. So I want to say again that I am deeply thankful to all the people who participated in the organization of this event. It's a pleasure to work with Colegio de México. It's a pleasure to work with the World Bank Group. And I believe that this has been a very good seminar. And although I didn't participate as part of this seminar, I think that is all I have to say. Have a nice day. And perhaps, as you know, we didn't quote any figures about gender. Probably next seminar we will have the information disaggregated by gender. But the point is that I want to thank Colegio de México as well as INEGI for hosting this event. I believe that these are very important efforts. The agenda is very relevant and it adds value to the existing knowledge in this sense. Thank you very much to the assistants, especially all of you who are present until the end. And without further ado, I only need to say that it is a pleasure for the World Bank to be participating in this type of event along with outstanding institutions such as Colegio de México and INEGI. Thank you very much to the support team as well as all the attendees.